My parents said, "Don't come to Thanksgiving. Your daughter is embarrassing. Your sister needs a drama-free day." My 6-year-old and I were already on the way to the airport to fly home. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or slam my hands against the steering wheel. Instead, I just felt a very cold, very clinical click in my mind. The internal ledger I had been keeping for 32 years finally balanced itself out, and the result was zero. My parents, Patricia and Gary, weren't asking, they were terminating a contract I had been paying for in blood and silence. They wanted the optics of a perfect construction empire for my sister Kayla's high-stakes investors, and apparently, my daughter Mia was a smudge on their pristine glass. Before we go further, have you ever been told you weren't perfect enough for a family photo? Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The hazards on my car blinked with a steady, clinical rhythm, echoing the way my brain was now processing reality. I didn't reach for a tissue. I reached for my phone. I didn't call Patricia back to explain that we were already 5 miles from the terminal. I didn't beg Gary to reconsider for the sake of his only granddaughter. I simply opened my airline app, navigated to our booking, and tapped cancel. $4,000. That was the price of our first-class, non-refundable tickets to Seattle. In their world, $4,000 was a rounding error on a construction bid. In my world, it was 30 handcrafted custom rings and countless hours at my jeweler's bench. I watched the confirmation screen glow against the gray dashboard. Flight canceled. The transaction of my loyalty was finally over. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long. For years, I was the one they called when the cameras weren't rolling. When Gary's construction firm was drowning in $75,000 of back taxes and the auditors were at the door, it wasn't the perfect sister Kayla who saved them. She was too busy maintaining her PR image in New York. It was me. I had quietly wired the money from my business savings, liquidating my inventory to keep the Henderson name off the front page of the business journals. I didn't ask for a thank you note. I asked for a place at the table. Now, I realized that my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. This wasn't a family crisis, it was a bad investment. Patricia and Gary didn't see a daughter or a grandchild when they looked at us. They saw branding material. To Patricia, life was a series of high-resolution optics. If a piece of the set didn't fit the aesthetic, if Mia's noise-canceling headphones or her occasional need for a quiet corner clashed with the unfiltered success they were selling to Kayla's investors, we were simply edited out. This is the trap of the branding mindset. They had normalized cruelty by calling it image management. They truly believed that having a drama-free day for a group of billionaire investors was more important than the heart of a 6-year-old child. They had spent so long performing a perfect life that they had forgotten how to actually live one. They thought that because they had raised me to be useful, I would continue to be their invisible safety net while they publicly erased me. I looked in the rearview mirror at Mia. She was still hugging that fox, her eyes searching mine for an explanation I was no longer willing to fabricate. I realized then that my parents weren't shocked by what they had done. They were only going to be shocked when I stopped playing the part they had written for me. I put the car in gear and merged back into traffic, but I wasn't heading for the airport. I was heading toward a complete audit of our lives. My parents wanted a drama-free holiday. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to give them a lifetime of my silence. And I was going to start by reclaiming every cent of the legacy they thought they had already stolen. The drive back from the highway wasn't long, but it felt like a funeral for the version of my life where I still tried to fit into their frames. I didn't head home. I took the first exit toward a local creamery, a place that smelled like caramelized sugar and the kind of warmth I had been chasing for 32 years. Mia was silent, her small hands still white-knuckled around that stuffed fox. I parked the car, but for 5 minutes, we just sat there. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the car except for Mia's shallow, shaky breathing. I looked at her and realized I was done letting my daughter audition for a role in a family that only wanted her as a background extra. Inside, the creamery was quiet. A woman with silver hair and an apron that smelled like fresh waffles looked up as we walked in. That was Catherine. She didn't look at Mia with the clinical scrutiny my mother used. She didn't see a drama to be managed. She saw a little girl whose eyes were too wide and whose fox was being squeezed too hard. Catherine didn't say a word. She just walked over to the side of the counter, pulled out a small, colorful, laminated card that said, "Quiet Corner," and pointed toward a booth in the back, away from the hum of the refrigerators. An older man, Frank, was sitting at the end of the counter with a newspaper and a cup of black coffee. He looked up, his eyes moving from my steady, cold expression to the way I was shielding Mia. He slid a napkin toward us as we sat down. A small, wordless gesture of solidarity. Catherine brought over 2 scoops of vanilla bean, but she didn't just hand them to Mia. She noticed Mia's noise-canceling headphones resting around her neck and leaned in, whispering so softly it barely registered as sound. She told Mia that the shop was her sanctuary today. For the first time since that phone call on the freeway, Mia's shoulders dropped 1 inch. I sat there, watching my daughter eat ice cream with a stranger who showed more empathy in 3 minutes than my parents had in 3 decades. I realized then that I had been operating under a false contract. I thought blood meant a guaranteed safety net. It didn't. It was just a biological coincidence. Catherine and Frank were strangers. Yet they were offering us a seat at a table I didn't have to build myself. It was a profound moment that tasted like cold, hard clarity. As we sat there, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a notification from social media. My sister Kayla had just posted. I opened it, expecting a rant about my dramatic exit. Instead, I saw a high-resolution photo of the Henderson estate. My parents were there, beaming in front of a sprawling Thanksgiving spread. Kayla and her husband were posed perfectly on either side. Even the cousins were there, looking like they were in a commercial for premium happiness. The caption read, "So incredibly blessed to have the whole family together for Thanksgiving. Our circle is finally complete." There was no mention of the daughter who had liquidated her business inventory to pay their $75,000 in back taxes. No mention of the granddaughter they had called embarrassing less than an hour ago. We hadn't just been uninvited. We had been deleted from the narrative. The eraser was clean, professional, and total. I stared at their smiling faces on the screen, felt the cold weight of the phone in my hand, and finally let go of the last shred of my loyalty. The Henderson circle was complete, but the jeweler was about to start an audit they weren't prepared for. We didn't go back to the small studio apartment I had been renting for $800 a month. I wasn't interested in the familiar. I was interested in the strategic. We moved into Catherine and Frank's guest house, a structure built of solid oak and heavy, meaningful silence. It sat at the edge of a property that felt less like a home and more like a fortress of accountability. Mia fell asleep on a sofa that didn't require her to be a prop. I sat at a kitchen table that didn't serve as a stage for Patricia's optics. Frank walked into the room, carrying a leather portfolio that looked older and more worn than my own resentment. He didn't offer a platitude or a hug. He offered a confession. Frank hadn't just been a random man with a newspaper at a creamery. He had been my grandmother's lead estate lawyer for over 35 years. He sat across from me and explained that he had spent decades as a silent observer to my systematic erasure from the family legacy. He described a specialized, heavy kind of grief, the silent regret of a guardian who watched a predator move into the house and did nothing but take notes. He admitted he had spent years caught between hope and reality. He hoped my mother, Patricia, would eventually find her conscience, and he struggled with the cold reality that she never would. He waited for Gary to show a single shred of fatherly integrity. But while Frank waited, they were busy rewriting the past. This is the silent regret of the watcher. Frank looked at me with eyes that had analyzed 1,000 wills and witnessed even more betrayals. He told me he watched them slowly push me out of my grandmother's life, one filtered lie at a time. He saw how they isolated her in those final months, telling her I was too busy with my jewelry work, too sensitive to handle her illness, or too unreliable to make the drive. He admitted his own inaction was a debt he now intended to settle with heavy interest. He hadn't been waiting for the right time to help me. He had been waiting for the right victim to finally stop acting like a victim and start acting like an auditor. My grandmother's jewelry shop, the original artisan workshop where I had learned to solder my first silver band at the age of 10, had been the center of her world and mine. In my memory, that shop was a sanctuary of blue velvet, the smell of polishing compound, and the rhythmic, comforting tap of a chasing hammer. In my parents' narrative, that shop was a failing liability they had saved through their construction firm's resources. Frank opened the portfolio and slid a single, yellowed document across the table. It was a property deed, dated exactly 7 years ago. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. My grandmother's handwriting had always been elegant, a flowing, lyrical script that looked like delicate wirework. The ink on this page was stiff and stagnant. The loops of the letters were forced, lacking the natural velocity of her hand. It was a copy of the transfer of the shop's ownership to Gary's construction company. Frank pointed to a subtle, jagged tremor in the capital letters. He explained that a person's handwriting is a biological contract, and this one had been breached. He hadn't stayed silent because he was indifferent. He had stayed silent because he needed the predators to leave a definitive trail of breadcrumbs made of ink and fraud. My parents weren't just cold and narcissistic. They were criminals. And the $1,500,000 wedding Kayla was currently hosting was being funded by the literal theft of my life's work. The audit was no longer about family drama. It was a criminal escalation. The guest house kitchen was no longer a place for meals. It was a war room. Frank and I sat under the harsh, clinical glow of a single overhead lamp, the table buried under a mountain of old estate records, bank statements, and correspondence. The air smelled like dust, old ink, and the sharp, metallic scent of a truth that had been buried for too long. Frank handed me a magnifying glass. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what I was looking for. I spent the next 4 hours performing a forensic audit of my own life, tracing the movement of every asset my grandmother had ever owned. The lethal discovery didn't come with a scream. It came with a quiet, hollow realization as I compared the property deed for the jewelry shop with a series of birthday cards my grandmother had sent me over 20 years. I stared at the signature on the transfer document, the one that had handed my future over to Gary's construction firm. To an outsider, it looked legitimate, but I was a jeweler. I spent my days looking at microscopic details in metal and stone. I knew the weight of a hand. I knew the way my grandmother's wrist used to hitch slightly on the letter J because of her arthritis. The signature on that deed was too perfect. It was a static, calculated imitation. It lacked the natural velocity and the biological imperfections of her real handwriting. Gary and Patricia hadn't just managed the inheritance. They had forged it. They had waited until she was too weak to protest. Or perhaps they hadn't waited at all. They had simply erased her wishes with a pen and a lie. I looked at the numbers Frank had calculated on a separate yellow pad. The value of the shop, the specialized equipment, and the inventory of rare gemstones they had liquidated totaled nearly $2 million. I sat back, the plastic chair creaking in the silence. The math was devastatingly simple. The $1,500,000 Patricia was currently spending on Kayla's unfiltered success wedding in Seattle wasn't the result of their hard work or a construction empire's profits. It was my stolen legacy rebranded as my sister's social triumph. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is for people who still have something to lose. I had lost everything 7 years ago. I just hadn't seen the receipt until now. This wasn't a family dispute about an embarrassing granddaughter or a drama-free Thanksgiving. It was a crime scene. My parents weren't just narcissists who preferred one daughter over another. They were thieves who had used my silence to fund their optics. I closed the folder. The sound was as sharp and final as a cell door locking. I looked at Frank, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely in control of the narrative. My parents wanted a drama-free day for their investors. They wanted a perfect wedding for Kayla. They wanted me to disappear quietly into the background. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted until the very second I didn't. I wasn't going to call the police yet. I was going to wait for the most expensive, most public stage they had ever built for themselves. Because when you're dealing with predators who live for optics, the only way to win is to destroy the lens. 1 year had passed. The air in Seattle smelled like $1,500,000 of performative joy. I stood at the back of the estate, watching the high society guests sip champagne paid for with my grandmother's stolen legacy. The optics were flawless, a pristine construction of white lilies and curated smiles, designed to hide the rot underneath. I wasn't there as a guest. I was there as the auditor. When Patricia finally saw me, the glass in her hand didn't just shake, it froze. I didn't wait for her to summon security. I walked directly to the podium, the heels of my boots clicking against the marble with the precision of a metronome. The music stopped. 1,000 eyes turned toward the invisible daughter, the one who was supposedly too embarrassing to exist in this frame. I leaned into the microphone, my voice coming out cold, clinical, and lethal. I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate a wedding funded entirely by a criminal enterprise. I watched Gary's face turn a violent shade of purple as I pulled a high-resolution scan of my grandmother's forged signature onto the massive display screens behind me. I explained to the investors in the front row that the stability they were betting on was built on a foundation of theft and ink. In that moment, I realized that letting go of blood ties isn't a betrayal, it's an act of self-preservation. I looked at my parents and realized they were never my family. They were just people who shared my DNA and overdrafted my compassion until the account was empty. Families show up. They don't erase children for the sake of a branding exercise. I turned my gaze to Mia, who was standing safely with Catherine and Frank, the people who had actually chosen her. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, white envelope. I didn't hand it to Kayla as a wedding gift. I handed it to Gary. It was a formal legal summons for the recovery of the jewelry shop and a $2,350,000 restitution claim for the misappropriated funds. Patricia's carefully constructed facade finally shattered. She staggered toward me, whispering about status and family loyalty. I didn't flinch. I looked her in the eye and delivered the finisher I had practiced in the quiet of the guest house. I told her that Mia was never the embarrassment. She was the true heir to everything they had tried to steal. They, on the other hand, were now officially irrelevant. As security approached, I didn't run. I stayed long enough to watch the drama-free day they had demanded descend into a clinical, documented collapse. The room was no longer a wedding, it was a crime scene of their own making. I walked off that stage without looking back, leaving the white lilies to wilt under the weight of the truth. The fallout was as absolute as a ledger reaching its final balance. Patricia and Gary's drama-free day had transformed into a documented public execution of their reputation. The $1,500,000 they had poured into that wedding was their final act of bankruptcy, not just financial, but moral. By the time the $2,350,000 restitution claim was verified, and the forgery was confirmed by a state investigator, the construction empire Gary had spent decades polishing turned out to be a hollow shell built on my grandmother's stolen bones. They lost the estate, they lost the country club memberships, they lost the only thing they ever truly valued, the optics of power. Reclaiming the jewelry shop didn't feel like a victory of destruction. It felt like an act of restoration. Stepping back into that workshop, the air still smelling of polishing, compound, and ancient silver, I realized that this was the sower's justice. Most people think revenge is about the fire, about watching the people who hurt you burn until there is nothing left but ash. But real justice, the kind that lasts, is about the garden you build afterward. I didn't turn the shop into a high-end boutique to compete with my mother's old social circles. I turned it into a sanctuary. It is now a workshop for artists and jewelers and artists with disabilities, a place where sensory-friendly quiet isn't a drama to be managed, but a standard to be honored. Mia spends her afternoons there, her noise-canceling headphones decorated with glitter and tiny silver foxes I forged for her myself. She isn't an accessory anymore. She is a collaborator. 6 months after the audit was finalized, I married Ethan in a ceremony that cost exactly what it was worth. 0 performative dollars. We did it at sunrise on the steps of the shop, with only Catherine and Frank as witnesses. There were no magazine photographers or high-stakes investors. There was only the truth. Ethan didn't choose me because I was a useful asset or a branding opportunity. He chose me because he saw the artisan behind the armor. Watching Mia flourish in this new life is the only evidence I ever needed that I made the right choice. She no longer looks at her grandparents through a screen, wondering why she isn't enough to be included in their frame. She is busy building her own world, one where love isn't conditional on a high-resolution aesthetic. Patricia and Gary have become ghosts irrelevant, small, and entirely disconnected from the legacy they tried to forge. They chose the image, I chose the reality. And in the end, the reality grew, while the image simply faded away. I sat in my workshop tonight, surrounded by the smell of ancient silver and real belonging. The biological noise has finally stopped. My parents and Kayla are just static on a frequency I no longer tune into. I look at the life I have built, the quiet, the craftsmanship, the way Mia laughs without apology, and I find total peace. To those of you who have always felt like the invisible one, like the smudge on a perfect family photo, stop auditioning. Your value is not a transaction to be negotiated by people who only see you as useful. I built my own table, and the view is perfect. Sometimes, the greatest gift people can give you is their rejection, because it forces you to build something better than what they were offering. Did Jenna take it too far? Or was this the only way to protect Mia? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of justice.